a briefing session. I'll declare this meeting open at 6:02. The town of Bassendean acknowledges past and present traditional owners of the land on which we gather to conduct this meeting and pays its respects to their elders, both past and present. I have no announcements without discussion, so we'll move on from that. Attendances, apologies and applications for leave of absence. We have an apology from Councillor Wilding. We have an apology from the Director of Community and Place, Ms Brennard, and I believe applications for leave of absence. Councillors, do I have any applications for leave of absence? No? Okay, so we'll move on from that. Councillors, do I have any declarations of... Councillor Ames.
Madam Mayor, I do have my hand up, but that's okay. Can I please apply for a leave of absence from the Sunday, the June the 16th through to the following Saturday, the 22nd of June. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Ames. Can I have a mover to approve that leave of absence? Councillor... We don't do that now. No, it's a briefing. So, Councillor Ames will do that next week.
Yes, like that's at the OCM this week. Thank you.
Yeah. So sorry, Councillor Ames. I was obviously moving a week ahead of myself. Okay, councillors, do we have any declarations of interest on any item on the agenda? No. Okay. We have no presentation. Councillor Ames, your hand is still up.
I might not be in the room, but I'm still very present. I just would like to seek some clarification, maybe through the to the CEO, just in regards to anything to do with the Bassendean Oval redevelopments. I wanted to find out if that was something that my previous impartiality conflict of interest still carries through.
It's just a priority project.
For the advocacy item. Thank you, Councillor Ames. I think for due process, we'll just record it as a impartiality interest. I think it's very broad, though. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Ames, for being diligent. Director of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Through the Chair, I'd just like to declare an interest in Council Agenda Item 12.3, the elected member representative on the Metropolitan Regional Road Group. My other employment is with the West Australian Local Government Association as the Local Roads Program Delivery Manager, and my role is to liaise with local governments in relation to the expenditure of the funds through the Metropolitan Regional Road Groups. So it's an impartial interest.
Thank you. Okay. Item 5, presentations and deputations. There are none. Item 6 is statements by members of the public. There are none. Item 7 is questions from members of the public. There are none. And item 8 is petitions. There are none. This takes us on to the agenda items for questions from councillors tonight, and also for presentation by the officers. The first agenda item is 12.2, Policy Review, Local Planning Policy Number 12, Residential Development and Fences. So I would ask the officer if he would move to the table in front of councillors so that thank you, Alex.
Thank you. So the purpose of this report is for Council to consider an amended Local Planning Policy Number 12, residential development for the purposes of advertising. The draft amended policy is in response to recent changes to Volume 1 of the Residential Design Codes, which were amended on the 10th of April. The purpose of the policy is to provide amended or alternative deemed to comply provisions of the art codes. In most instances where a development complies with the deemed to comply provisions, the development is exempt from the requirement to obtain development or planning approval. So approximately 30 to 40% of development proposals within town do not require development approval or planning approval. This policy would look to facilitate potentially a further increase by amending some of the deemed to comply provisions. There are some of the key changes to note relate to primary street setbacks for dwellings on corner lots. So under the current R codes, there's a dispensation where a dwelling faces the original secondary street of the original parent lot. They're afforded a setback variation to that. From the town's perspective, we've actually looked to bring that to both the secondary and primary street, so both instances on a corner lot, allowing a reduced setback on the basis that there's been several examples in the town where defining what is the primary and what was the secondary street for the original parent lot has been quite difficult. We have dwellings that face the corner itself on those kite-shaped lots that we have. The dwelling, we've made it more generous in terms of being compatible, and a key distinction as well, where a carport is forward of the building and forward of the primary street setback, we've defined unenclosed as open on all sides. Under the new version of the R codes, unenclosed is open on two sides. So in theory, if it's forward of the building, they could still have two walls on the carport and it be unenclosed, which from a streetscape perspective can be quite impactful. We've made some deemed to comply provisions for sightlines, for front fences and the like, to basically align with what staff's expectations would be if someone proposed a front fence within 1.5 metres. It would still meet the design principle in terms of there still be the ability for a person reversing a vehicle to see through or over the fence, and the provisions allow for that. It just means they won't necessarily require development approval from the town. Outbuildings, we've increased the deemed to comply wall height from 2.4 or 2.7, depending on the size of the outbuilding, to 3 metres. This is on the basis that Part C or the medium density codes enable that as of right. So we brought it forward to Part B or the lower density codes. And it's also been a consistent approach from council to approve a 3 metre wall height from an outbuilding. We figured it might be easier to bring it into the deemed to comply. It makes sense. From the staff's perspective, we're generally comfortable with it, particularly for Part B, which is a low density codes, which are going to be larger lots anyway. Ancillary dwellings, we removed the previous concession on vehicle parking, acknowledging there's now greater flexibility on ancillary dwellings. They can be on, there's no, previously under the previous version of the codes, it was some minimum 350 square metre lots, was the deemed to comply requirement. They've removed that, so you can have an ancillary dwelling on a 220 square metre block. So we've removed the parking concession on that to now enable us to assess it on a case-by-case basis if they are proposing a variation of the car parking. We've carried through provisions relating to stormwater and outdoor living area from the existing scheme, so there's no change to those. I do note though, under Part A of the R codes, we aren't able to vary those without the consent of the WAPC, so we will need to obtain their consent. And the last comment I'll make is a co-author of the report has declared an impartiality interest, acknowledging they are a resident of the town. Any questions?
Councillors, any questions? So I have a few. So thank you for providing that information. And most of the changes appear quite sensible, so thank you for providing that. I have a couple of questions which may or may not, and maybe it's asking your opinion on a few things. I'm interested in the maximum of 60% frontage for garages or carports. Is this a standard? 60% is the maximum. Is that standard across most local governments?
So that is, sorry?
I think it's setbacks for garages
Yep,
and carports.
sorry.
I think it's, in the old policy it was C1-2I.
Yep. Just bring up the comparative.
Sorry, I should have it on my
No, that's
computer as well.
So on the left-hand side of that table is the existing provision within the R codes, which already contains that the width of the carport does not exceed 60% of the frontage. So we're continuing that provision across. Given it's already within the R codes are a statewide planning framework
Okay.
document, it would be statewide.
Okay. As a question from a non-planner, if you've got a very wide frontage property and 60% of it's taken up with garage or carport, is there any scope for the town to put in like 60% or no more than so many metres frontage? I guess I'm curious about those blocks that might, for instance, be very large frontage palatial places that might put garages in there from here to ever.
So that provision, C 1.2, relates to carports. Under the R codes, which we're not seeking to vary for the garages, they do have a slightly different requirement
Yes.
in terms of the frontage. So the garage width, which is under 5.2.2 of the R codes, is that it should not occupy more than 50% of the frontage of the lot.
Excellent. Sorry, I actually should have put the reference numbers there, but I didn't when I was writing my questions. Apologies for that. The other one is the stormwater provisions, which I believe might be clause 5.3.9, if I've got that right.
Yep.
And I'm just curious about what conditions would prevent stormwater from being retained on site. I'm assuming it might relate to things like clay soil or...
Yep, that's correct.
Okay, is clay soil the only reason why you couldn't retain stormwater on site?
Generally speaking, it just relates to clay soils is the only reason as to why.
Okay. And is there any relationship, like, if a developer does not want to retain the stormwater on site and they can connect with the town's stormwater system, drainage system, I know they have to pay a connection fee. So can they avoid putting the infrastructure in to retain stormwater on site and just connect to the town's drainage or not? I don't think they can.
So if someone was to propose off-site stormwater retention, they'd still need approval from the town's infrastructure team, so there's an approval process from that. Essentially, the variation, or what we're looking to do in terms of augmenting or amending the deemed to comply provisions, is enable a developer to go down the path of seeking to obtain approval from infrastructure or allowing them to contain stormwater on site. So it provides both options for dealing stormwater moving forward. It may be in their instance whether a development application only needs planning approval where they're proposing off-site retention because they're close to the river, it's high clay soils, rather than making them lodge a development application fee. By allowing this as a deemed to comply option, they simply then need just to go through the approval process with our infrastructure team.
Okay.
So rather than having a double up of approval processes, it just becomes one approval process. I'd also like to add, in terms of under the Part C, which is the medium density codes, we've actually just brought those deemed to comply provisions forward into Part B, the low density. So for Part C or a medium density, it's an as a right option to connect in. They obviously still need to obtain approval from our infrastructure team to do so. We've just brought those provisions into the lower density or Part B of the codes.
Thank you. Councillors, if you don't mind, my other curiosity related to why we would allow replacement of like for like in respect to metal deck carports. I would have thought we might try to improve on that, but I'm not sure what the logic might be behind that. There's probably some very logical reason for it.
It's just more if they're existing, it allows people to maintain and replace them like for like. There are some properties that do have metal decked carports, and then from a streetscape perspective, if they're existing, they're not burdening the streetscape any more than what exists, and allowing them to continue to have the existing carport arrangement.
So if council was minded to, because many of the other clauses that you have relate the construction of the carport to the main building in, I think the word you used was comparable materials rather than...
Compatible.
Yeah, compatible, yeah.
So
Is there any potential, instead of replacing a carport, a metal carport like for like, is there any potential to change that to have the carport made of material, a new carport, a new approval for a carport relating to the existing main building?
So if you were looking to delete that provision, it would just mean it wouldn't be a deemed to comply option. So if someone wanted to do a like-for-like replacement of a metal deck carport, it would trigger the need for development approval from the town, in which we would assess it against the relevant design principles of the ARCODES. So
Would
that
that-
is an option for council if they
Would
wish to
that
do
create an undue burden on staff?
I wouldn't have thought so, no.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Sorry, Councillor Burke.
Sorry, through you, Madam Mayor, a question for you, Planning Manager Alex.
Councillor Burke, could I ask you just
Sorry,
to move
there
your
we go.
microphone
Yeah.
closer?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just in regards to the outbuildings or the carports and replacing like for like, particularly the metal, has consideration for glare being factored into it, particularly angles and things like that?
So, in short, no. I know we've had glare, for example. If we're going to amend the deemed to comply provisions of the ARCODES as well, it needs to relate back to the relevant design principles. So, for outbuildings or carports, for outbuildings, for example, the design principle relates to the visual amenity of the neighbouring property and or the streetscape. Measuring glare or putting a deemed to comply provision on glare would be difficult. There's nothing under the current ARCODES that contemplates glare as a planning consideration, particularly if you're looking to amend a deemed to comply provision.
I know other councils have got glare considered in their planning approvals. I'm looking at, you're raising the height, you're looking at increased density, possibly some 2 stories, and what's going to be the impact of those roofs into neighbouring properties. Thinking around, I guess, a community that is comfortable for all and neighbours living next door, could consideration to glare similar to other councils be factored into their planning approval when looking at metal for outbuildings replacements, particularly the height?
It can. So this is obviously this report is for the purpose of advertising, so we can seek community consultation and community input on the draft local planning policy. We can obviously look to make changes to the policy when it's brought back to council, or if council wanted to make minor amendments to the policy, they could look to do so at the decision next week. It'd be reluctant to make an amendment to a deemed to comply provision relating to glare. There's nothing really to guide it. If council was to pursue provisions relating to glare or things that related to, say, outbuilding colours or the like, you wouldn't relate it back to a deemed to comply provision. You would be relating it to an additional provision if they didn't meet the deemed to comply requirement. So if they don't meet the deemed to comply requirement, planning approval is triggered and we can do an assessment on it and contemplate glare. But if they meet the deemed to comply, there's no need for development approval in most circumstances, unless it's within a heritage area.
Thank you for that. Just quickly, I have 2 more queries. I'm curious as to why we would allow sheet metal fencing capped within the secondary street boundary. I think this is just on the corner lots, correct? So the primary boundary requires visual permeability, for lack of a better word, but the secondary boundary can have sheet metal capped fencing. And again, I'm wondering what capacity we have, given what you've just said about the deemed to comply. I'm wondering what capacity we have to perhaps seek better outcomes for these corner lots with the secondary boundary. Is there capacity for council to actually ask for something a little bit better than capped sheet metal fencing? And again, apologies for not putting the clause in there. It's in a few of the clauses. You can take that on notice if you like and talk to me.
Yeah, so with that, sheet metal fencing is standard colour-bond fencing.
Yeah.
So we've allowed that on the secondary street because we're not requiring visual permeable fencing, which is what's required from the primary street. Secondary street, we allow a solid fence, and it enables people to have a private backyard as private.
Okay. And the last question, I'm actually going to perhaps chat tomorrow about that, because that's more seeking your guidance on what we may or may not be able to do in respect to the problem I see is that fences are installed and then we have tree roots damaging those fences in 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and we have liability that's associated with that. And I'm just curious as to what you might perceive as being a solution for that. There may be no solutions, but nevertheless, you have the planning expertise that I don't have, so would be very interested in your thoughts on that.
Yep.
So I'll take that up with you tomorrow if that's okay.
I'm happy to provide a bit of a commentary on that now.
Yep.
So from our perspective, if it's deemed to comply, so you could have a fence, whether it's on the primary street or secondary street, it can be deemed to comply and not require any approval from the town. We can't control construction methods for those fences. It would be in a circumstance where a planning approval is triggered. We'd be looking to realistically probably be imposing an advice note suggesting they investigate a construction method that doesn't look to go too deep or result in troubles for the verge tree or subsequent roots of that verge tree. It would be quite difficult to do anything else, particularly acknowledging from a design principle perspective, we're looking at streetscapes. We've got a built form and character study which is encouraging brick pillars and picket fencing. If they go down a brick pillar path, that's obviously going to require footings and a little bit more intrusive as well. So it's trying to find that balance, and it would be more or less putting an advice note on the developer to investigate alternative construction methods or look at their footings to ensure they're not as impactful potentially on a verge tree.
Thank you. Councillors, further questions? Councillor Plifka.
Yeah, I might just follow on in relation to the secondary street fencing. So you mentioned that what we were trying to encourage was the picket fences between brick columns. Obviously on the primary street there needs to be that visual permeability, so that all that would happen there is the pickets are, I suppose, spaced further apart. Would we be able to perhaps then on the secondary street just suggest that they construct in the same way but with the pickets put closer together, or even abutting, so it wouldn't be visually permeable but would still carry through the same character as the primary street? Or is that sort of a step too far in terms of the expense?
I would suggest picket fence wouldn't be as expensive as a colour-bond fence. Not too sure, but it's something that could be looked at. But it's more, it could be looked at. I wouldn't necessarily suggest to go with it. Secondary street fencing, and if you look at most of them, a lot of them would have colour-bond fencing. It's a standard side boundary fence, and that's almost how we look at it from a planning perspective. It's a side boundary fence. It just happens to be that it's on a corner. The R codes talk about a street fence, and it does encompass both, but from our perspective, it's about allowing someone to have a private or privacy in their backyard.
As long as we could accommodate the privacy and if the expense wasn't too onerous on the developer, then we could potentially explore these other methods and say that, well, yes, we understand that colour bond is deemed to comply, everybody uses it everywhere, but can we do better, I suppose?
Yeah, you could have that as a deemed to comply option as well.
In terms of...
So I think the only restriction that we primarily have is specifying on the fibrous cement sheeting on the fencing, and then when the primary street is not having your metal sheeting on the primary street as well. So it's allowing that flexibility of that lower cost fence on the side as a deemed to comply option. If it was a wooden fence, it would also be compliant as a material. It's not specified. It's more to the intent of the policy provisions there is to mainly focus on the primary street and not have the colour bond fencing on as a low-high fence in the primary street boundary, or a fibro cement, which in theory they could have as a deemed to comply if it met heights, but from a material perspective it doesn't add to the streetscape, and we can relate it back to that design principle.
So in terms of the deemed to comply, to, I suppose, minimise the number of applications that have to be determined because they'd already comply.
Yep.
I've noticed around the district there's increasing amounts of the PVC equestrian fencing, so on the other end of the spectrum, quite permeable. Is that something that's deemed to comply, or is that dealt with on a case-by-case basis?
If it's essentially visually permeable, which that style of fencing is, it would meet the deemed to comply and wouldn't trigger the need for approval.
Okay. Now, the example with the lot which is smaller than 350 square metres, so I understand that now you can have, as of right, an ancillary dwelling, is that?
Yep, so with ancillary dwellings, there used to be a provision that the minimum lot area requirements to accommodate an ancillary dwelling was 350 square metres. They've moved that. They've given greater flexibility under the medium density codes as well, so it can be an ancillary dwelling. Essentially, it used to only be in conjunction with a single house. You can now have it in conjunction with group dwellings or multiple dwelling developments. They've basically opened it up to as an alternative form of housing.
But I suppose looking at the 350 square metre lot, so as the size, I mean, under these deemed to comply provisions, so you can have a 70 square metre ancillary dwelling, you could have a 60 square metre shed, and then you could have the actual house itself, and all of that could happen without the development approval.
They would still need to meet other provisions in the R codes which would govern that, such as site coverage,
Area.
yep, or site area, or open space requirements. So depending on the density, it's between 50% and 45% that is required to be.
So we have that
Yep.
control.
Yeah, there is. Yep.
Okay, excellent. Thanks.
That's right.
Councillors, if there's no further questions, I'd like to thank the manager for planning. Microphone on.
Very good.
Okay, councillors. 12.3, which is elected member representation, Metropolitan Regional Road Group. Thank you, Mr. Pearson. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. In relation to this report, we're seeking councillor representation on the subgroup of the Metropolitan Regional Road Group. The state provides funding to local government for roads via the State Road Funding to Local Government Agreement, and that is administered by regional road groups who go through and look at projects that are submitted and recommend those through to the State Advisory Committee for funding approval each year. So it's important that councillors are represented on that committee to make sure that the funding is allocated to the priority roads in each region. So what will happen is each council will put in submissions for road funding, and then they're assessed against multi-criteria analysis and put forward to the Metropolitan Regional Road Groups for funding endorsement. In terms of the Metropolitan Regional Group, there's also subgroups. So the town of Bassendean is a member of the Eastern subgroup, which involves Bayswater, Bassendean, Swan and Mundaring. So we're really seeking a council representative and a deputy, should that council representative be unavailable.
Thank you. Councillors, are there any questions on this item? No. Okay, thank you very much, sir. We'll now move on to item 12. Councillor Ames.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and through you. Just a quick query in regards to, I suppose, the evolution of this group. I've been on council for a few years now, and it sort of hasn't been on our radar in regards to a representative of this group. Is this a new group that's formed? Is it now seeking council representatives as a new adventure? Just some information in regards to that, and I suppose why now this has been brought to our attention.
Through the chair, thank you for the question. It's not a new group. It's something that's been around for a fair while. Typically, it's the call for council representatives on this is put up at election time. After you have an election, when you look at all the committees that councillors are serving on, this one is typically put up as well. But it appears that it hasn't been previously here.
Councillor Ames, I'm assuming that answers your question.
Yes,
Councillors,
absolutely. Thank you very much.
any further question? Councillor Polifka?
Yeah, just following on from that, so you listed a whole lot of other local governments in the eastern region. So they've been having these meetings for years without any representation from Bassendean.
Through the chair, no, that's not totally correct, sorry. There's always officer representation at those meetings, so there's always a technical officer, and they have technical officer meetings, and they have elected member meetings as well. So there has been representation at those meetings. I think the attendance by councillors at some of the meetings has been a bit hit and miss from some of the, through my current role. I've been attending all of the subgroup meetings, and some are very well attended and some not so well attended. So I think it would be good if we can start lifting that representation rate up.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Councillors, if there's no further questions, we'll move on to item 12.4, Low Cost Urban Roads Safety Program. And so this is also your forte to discuss with us.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. As indicated in the report, I believe there was a presentation given to councillors approximately a year ago by representatives from Main Roads just to talk about this program. So it's a program that Main Roads have introduced to try and get some low-cost urban road safety treatments into the road network. I suppose it was put on local government as a bit of a surprise. It was something we were expecting, then all of a sudden Main Roads started approaching us saying that we have areas that are eligible for this funding, so it's a good thing in that regard. The areas are selected on the basis of criteria associated with road safety. Main Roads recommend some treatments for those roads, and then it's up to the local government to go away and see if they are the treatments they think are the right treatments for their particular instances, and also to consult with the community to make sure that they are happy with some of those treatments as well. As detailed in the report, it's fully funded by Main Roads with the exception of some of the administration side of it and the community engagement. But from my experience, it has been quite successful in areas. The take-up by the community seems to vary from area to area. Some are very interested in it and want lots of treatments, some not so many. But I think that community engagement is therefore a very important part of it.
Thank you. Councillors, are there questions on this item? On that, I will go to the next item, which is 12.5, advocacy priorities. Thank you very much. So 12.5, Mr. CEO, I believe this is going to be something you will speak to.
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor. Yes, this is the result of a notice of motion that you put some time ago, very recently, and that was unanimously carried by council that this particular council should have an advocacy priority, and we should review that annually. And I think at the time we discussed it, I said timing was actually perfect, given we're about to approach the March state and federal elections, and we do have a number of projects that we are going to require financial assistance for. After undertaking some research, and I think one of the best local governments in the area doing this is Town of Vic Park. Vic Park have a policy that guides their advocacy priorities program. So we've taken a look at that particular policy. We've customised that to suit what we think is the town of Bassendean. It's there for councillors' endorsement next week. But essentially what we're saying is that annually we should look at what our current priorities are. We should have a separate workshop for that during particularly the budget workshops, and we should agree as a group what our advocacy projects are, so that the Mayor and the CEO, when they do start advocating with politicians or the like, at least we do so with the full support of our council, rather than having to come back and seek approval each time. The report also goes up. The report talks about the process, but also is suggesting 3 priority areas for this first round of advocacy priorities. And I've listed 3 in order of priority. Priority 1 is the Jubilee Reserve redevelopment. It has a strategic alignment in that we actually have a master plan that we've invested in, had extensive community consultation at that point, so it's supported by our community. It is in our long-term financial plan. and we know that we have a gap of about 5.5 million in funding. So straight up, we have an advocacy position on that particular project. The next project I'm suggesting is priority 2, is the fact that the town centre has a number of strategies that have been implemented by council: the land asset strategy, LPS 11, the town centre master plan, and again our long-term financial plan. So 2 projects I'm suggesting should be lifted out of those reports relate to sites that we don't own but have been vested with us. Lot 9644, which this council has deemed appropriate to relinquish its control over and have the state government look at it for housing and mixed use. And the other one is the BIC Reserve, which is quite topic at the moment, the Child Health Clinic site, where our land asset strategy indicates that the excision of that site should take place as quickly as possible, and it should be used for residential development in line with LPS 11. So there's 2 sites for priority 2, and we're not requesting any money for those sites. So those 2 particular priorities are pure advocacy, lobbying state government to actually start that process and to start with the job of building high-rise residential in our town centre. Priority 3 is probably our biggest project. It is the Bassendean Oval redevelopment. It is supported by the Town Centre Master Plan. It is supported by a recent project that this council has funded, being a feasibility study in the Master Plan worth $168,000, and will require significant funding. The issue why that is number 3, even though it's probably our most important project, is the timing. We do not yet have the feasibility study or the master plan to tell government exactly what we are building. But we know that it is coming, and we know that stage 2, should we get to stage 2, is going to be a large design component, which could be in the order of $400,000 or $500,000 to get the detailed design to go to tender and get the construction documents. So our advocacy approach going to that is probably likely to be to convince state and federal funding to put it on notice that it is a priority project for the Eastern region. It will require significant funding in the long term, but in the short term, the ask may be for $500,000 in additional planning studies to take us to the next level. Happy to take any questions.
Councillors, Councillor Polifka.
Yeah, look, the numbering certainly got my attention in terms of the priorities. Look, the town centre development, don't really care where that gets put, because as you say, that's sort of neutral on cost. Jubilee and the Bassendean Oval, are we able to seek funding for Jubilee in that amount of 5.5 without having an adverse effect on our ability to also gain the funding that we would need for the Bassendean Oval? I mean, can we get both, or might there at some point be the response, well, we've already given you the money for Jubilee, you can't have more for Bassendean Oval?
Yeah, look, I can't speak for the politicians in which party may or may not be in power at that time, but it is a risk. But having said that, we've done the work around Jubilee, and we've just started the work for Bassendean. So, because it is a project that is much more forward in its planning, I think we need to achieve it, and we know that the gap, even by taking the basketball courts out, the gap is about 5.5 million, and that is significant for the town to undertake by itself. I would imagine the Bassendean Oval one might be more targeted for the next election cycle, because we are still at least 2 years away from having what I would consider the detailed design ready to prepare a business case to federal government. So I don't think it's one or the other. I just think from a timing point of view, Jubilee is ready to go. Bassendean Oval is probably 2 years away, so we need to put the government on notice. The other thing I can say is that the federal election boundaries are changing. It does put us in a bit better position if we are no longer with the federal seat of Perth and we're in Hasluck or Cowan. I think they're much more marginal, so I think also that the Bassendean over redevelopment is transformational, so I think from a point of view of government, they actually like being involved in the transformational projects. So it might be that Jubilee attracts significant state funding through the CSRFF and other sources, but doesn't attract a lot of support from the federals, but the opposite would be true for the other project.
So the priority is priority in time as opposed to, I suppose, order of importance or something of that nature.
It's a combination, but I think if you look at the policy says, have you done the work? And with Jubilee, we've done the work. We've spent quite a sum of money on planning. We've done the consultation. It's a previous resolution of council. We've got ageing infrastructure there, so I think we've done the work. So it is timing, and I think we owe it to the community to see it through. The other project is we haven't done the amount of work. We don't have the business case yet, so.
So, if I can follow on from that, those questions, I would ask Mr. CEO, would it be possible to perhaps not number these projects? For instance, we know Jubilee Reserve redevelopment, what we want from there. We know what we want from the town centre. We know what we want from the Bassendean Oval. And it would be my assumption that some of these would be seeking financial support from different levels of government at different times. And given that we're reviewing these every year, would it be possible to simply list our priorities but not number them?
Yeah, look, that's definitely an option for council. I don't see a major issue with that. We'll just need to see the impact on the policy before next week to see whether we also need then to tweak the policy.
I also have another follow-up question, which is throwing one in from left field, but here we go. Given that the Ashfield Flats project, which is a shared project between several agencies, however, the town of Bassendean tends to be the lead agency for implementation, and given that there is no way that the town can facilitate that project without state and federal funding, I'm wondering if the administration would be would include the Ashfield Flats project as an advocacy project, because without funding, major funding, there is no way that that project can be delivered in any way, shape or form. So I'm curious about your thoughts on that one.
I might start first and then ask Nicole to jump in, but I think the reason that's not on there is for the simple reason that Councillor Palifka was trying to make. I think it's already a project. We've already have support from the Swan River Trust and DBCA, and there's already an application for funding in. And I think if we advocate for something that we all think should happen because it's good for the environment, and our major government agencies are already lobbying for it, I think it does give the state, all federal parties, the opportunity to go, well, let's just go with that priority, which we were going to fund anyway, and let's forget about Jubilee and Bassendean Oval. And we are only 19% landowners in Ashfield Flats, and there's the agencies are keen to drive that. So I think we don't dilute our priorities.
That's a good point.
Nicole,
Ms Davies, did you want to?
Thanks, through the Mayor. I agree with those comments that DBCA in particular would probably be a lead in advocacy if we weren't successful with the current grant application. So we're due to find out in May or June about the Urban Rivers and Catchments Program application.
Okay, so thank you. I'll just backpedal on that question. Thank you very much. Councillors, further questions? Okay, so with that, councillors, we'll move on to the next item, which is, council policies review. There are several policies there listed for review. They have been attached with track changes and without, as clean copies. Did you want to have someone speak to this?
Yes, thanks, Madam Mayor. I might quickly introduce the item and then ask the Manager of Governance to talk to each of the policies and to take questions. I can also assist at some point, but we have taken the approach to by department go through, or by directorate go through and look at some of our policies as required under the Act, and through our budget process we also identified that some of the budget savings that we have identified were also controlled by policy, so it was incumbent upon us to, if we were to prepare a budget with some savings in certain areas that it has an effect on policy, we should get the policies dealt with in the first instance. And to that I mean the council member ICT policy. The policy that I might talk to now before I hand over to the Manager of Governance so is the council briefing session policy. That was a policy that myself and full council spent some time on with some discussions at CEO forums. It was also discussed as part of the workshop, I think, when we started out with a facilitator in Gary Hunt. And I would just like to say that most of the changes to that policy reflect what was agreed jointly in a session with myself and the councillors present, but I have also taken the liberty of reducing or deleting public question time at briefing sessions and written questions at a briefing session. And my justification for that is the fact that the purpose of the briefing session is for councillors first and foremost to inform themselves on the items that they need to vote on at the following week. And it's also for us to invite members of the public to make deputations or statements in relation to reports, which also assist council in making good decisions. What I don't think adds any value is the public asking questions when they have the opportunity to ask the questions at the OCM the following week. So for efficiency and effectiveness, the briefing session policy has been reduced to the things we discussed, which was deputations being 5 minutes and being the preferred method of taking a deputation rather than, again, at the OCM, and removing those requirements to have question times as well as statement time. Otherwise, that policy is pretty much the same. We still are transparent by having a briefing session that's live recorded. It's open to the public. So all of those things remain the same. And the ICT policy, which we spoke briefly about at the budget workshop only last week, that relates to a review of the SAT determination, which happens every April, and on review of the SAT determination to set our budget for councillors' allowances and meeting fees, which we do annually. That is the guiding document, and on reviewing that document it was made clear that when you're looking at getting reimbursement in lieu of expenses by having an allowance, it's quite clear that the reimbursement should reflect the cost of the expenses rather than the words used in the policy is a windfall gain for council members. So we also request council consider the changes in that policy and see if we've hit the sweet spot. We've identified it as being about 60% of the maximum, which is about $2,100 per annum. But it's up to council to determine whether that determination is accurate, and we're happy to make those changes next week. Thank you.
Councillors, I'll open it up to questions now. Councillor Plifka.
Yeah, just with the proposed removal of the public question time and statements, so in any given month, so combination of both the briefing session and the OCM, what proportion of questions and statements do we get at the briefing session in any event?
It's not a great deal, but I don't think the purpose of the policy is to be, if you've got a policy that says it must happen, it must happen. I've been in this chamber and we've had topical issues, whether it's LPS 11, community transport and others. But I really think if you go back to what the purpose of a briefing session is, it is for councillors to understand the officer's report and to give the community, particularly those that are affected either through a development application or immediately affected through a loss of a service, to make a statement and to make a deputation to tell you how they're feeling. I don't think asking a question assists anybody at that point, because who are they asking the question of? They can't ask the question of a councillor because you're not informed. That's the reason the briefing session is to be informed. And is it right for the community to be asking a question of an officer at that particular meeting when the officer's got a report that's written? A community member can ring a councillor as their point of contact and ask any question they like, or to make their points known. They can turn up the following week and fill the gallery and ask questions. But I think for effective and efficient government, the fact that you're allowing questions at a briefing session, to me, is ineffective and doesn't meet the purpose of the briefing session.
In terms of what potential questions could look like, I mean, if there were members of the public that were asking, I suppose, technical questions, if we had members of the public that had particular expertise, that by asking that question, and not to suggest that it would happen that often, because obviously the administration's across most issues, but on the off chance that someone in our community asks a question that wasn't considered, then there might be the possibility that then the officer could take that on board and incorporate that in to their recommendation for the OCM, whereas if the question were just asked at the OCM, then the officer might be, I suppose, put on the spot and not have an opportunity to take on board what might have been a meaningful question. As I said, I don't think it'll happen all the time, but I wouldn't, I suppose, discount our community occasionally coming up with a question which is certainly salient and one which the officer might want to consider in more detail.
Yeah, that's possibly true, but from my experience, a statement is always, most people make a statement before they make a question these days. So if you've got the floor for 2 minutes, you can make a statement by saying that I don't think you've got all the right information in the report. For instance, have you considered X, Y, and Z? But
look, I'd prefer that they put it by way of a question rather than turning up and saying you're wrong. Saying have you considered X, Y, Z? It's probably a more polite way of doing it. But I suppose that's just one example.
Majority of the questions from the public at a briefing session of a technical nature would probably be taken on notice anyway, which they still have the opportunity to do by doing questions on notice of an OCM and meeting the deadline, which still allows officers time to prepare before that evening, which we do now. As I said, that's my interpretation of the briefing session. It's up to council then to revert back to including a question time in the briefing session. And if you do that, then I think it was Madam Mayor's suggestion that rather than have another 15 minutes, it's deputation and question time is 15 minutes in its entirety. So you're either going to make a
statement and question time.
So statement, and so you're either going to make a statement or a question, or you can do one of each. But we've got 15 minutes. So that's the other way to do it, is to have a 15-minute window to do either or.
Councillors, further questions? Councillor Ames, you're still with us?
Yes, absolutely. No further questions. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, councillors, if there's no further questions on these, I will leave that one. Okay, so we'll go to item accounts paid. Now, generally, councillors, any questions you might have on this need to be taken on notice so that the Mr. White can provide responses in writing. So I'm assuming there's no burning questions for this item at the moment. If you do, can I suggest that you put them in writing in the next day or two for Mr. White? I don't believe there are any motions of which previous notice has been given. I have no announcements of notice of motion for the next meeting, which actually would be the council meeting, so that's actually perhaps interesting that that's in there. Urgent business, none. Confidential business, none. This brings us to the closure of the meeting at 6:52 p.m. and the next briefing session will be held on Tuesday, the 18th of June 2024, commencing at 6 p.m. and the next ordinary council meeting will be held on Tuesday, the 25th of June, commencing at 6 p.m. I'll declare this meeting closed. Thank you, one and all.